It's okay to heckle, yeah. No, in all honesty, I love open questions. Just throw them out when you got them, okay? Some of you I've known for a long time. It's good to see you. Some of you are meeting me for the first time. That's a quote from Austin Powers. No? Anyway, what a great movie. I'm Michael Coburn. I've been at Percona about 11 years, and I've been working on a lot of different areas. I started as a consultant. I'm actually back as a consultant now, but in between, I worked in support, I worked in managed services, I was the product manager for PMM for about 3 years, up until 2020. This is a photo from earlier this year, or I should say tail end of last year, where Peter and I were 2 out of 8 that were able to make the summit of a 5,600 meter mountain in Mexico. Peter actually unfortunately broke his sunglasses on the way up, and I think he actually damaged his eye. He got frozen eyeball or something. It was quite surreal, but we had a great time at the cumbre, the top of the mountain. It's a blast. If you guys have never done mountains before, it sounds like it's a big deal. Well, I guess it kind of is, but it's also a lot of fun. It's a lot of satisfaction when you get to the top. So other than that, I love things like hockey. I like being active. I like being outdoors. So what are we here for today, though? We're going to be talking about PMM, and it's a little bit of a next level. Maybe it's advanced, maybe it's intermediate advanced. The intent is, or at least the expectation for this group, is you've got passing familiarity with the product. Maybe you've already got it deployed, and you want to understand what more can you do with it. That's what I'm hoping I can leave you with today. Maybe you walk away with 1 or 2 nuggets. I've got about 6 or 7 altogether. The talk itself should not go the full 50 minutes. I'm hoping I can leave some time at the end where we can take some questions, and I can also maybe do things on the fly. It's going to be demo, so it might not work, but we'll hope for the best. And maybe you guys who have experience can also help me walk through if I'm making any mistakes, okay? So we're going to look at the different ways of getting data into PMM, and then we're going to look at different ways of taking that data that you've already integrated, and how do you display it, what different dashboards might exist already out there in the wild, and how do you customize them. And then I want to touch on some of the alerting angles and the advisors. The last 2 are more just an awareness of what's in the tool that maybe you haven't enabled completely or something to that effect, okay? And again, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm really open to taking questions. If I'm going too fast, speaking too quickly, or not fast enough, just let me know. Have any questions also, just raise your hand, and I'll point at you, and we'll take those questions. So anything so far? Okay. So let's start off with just getting everybody on the same page. Who here has used PMM before? Okay, I'm showing a good 95%. This is good. Okay. So for those who haven't touched it before, it's a monitoring and management platform. It's built on other open source tools to monitor your database environment. We can extend it. Today we're going to look at different ways of getting data that isn't databases into it. But the idea is that first and foremost, the tool is designed to consume MySQL, Mongo, and PostgreSQL type databases. And why is that? Well, again, we're using other tools like Victoria Metrics, which is similar to Prometheus, or Grafana, which is the graphing tool. They work with lots of different stuff, but the first-class citizens, we tend to call it, are the MySQL exporter, the MongoDB exporter, and the PostgreSQL exporter. We have taken a lot of ownership on that at Percona to make sure it works well with PMM. So it's really well battle-tested, and it's going to work out of the box. Question? The question is, what are the exporters? The exporters are designed to collect data and then make them available to be scraped from something else. So in PMM, we've got several databases in there. The main database that's going to take up most of your disk space storage on disk is your Victoria Metrics, which is, I'm not even sure if I'm going to use the right word if I call it a fork. It might even be, it's a whole separate project, but it's related to the Prometheus time series storage, which is quite popular these days. It was up on the CNCF dashboard we saw it this morning, etc. And Prometheus has the data set storage itself, the daemon, and then there's how do you get data in there? And there are over 300 or so different exporters already written. So if in your environment you're running MSSQL or Redis or Memcache or whatever, there's already an exporter out there, and you really just need to launch this. And I'm going to show you how to integrate with a non-standard exporter. Mine's going to be very simple. It's called Process Exporter. But the idea is you get this daemon running, this exporter daemon, and then you tell PMM about it, and it'll start pulling in data. Okay? Our product also works with things outside of that ecosystem of the traditional, deploy it yourself on compute. It'll work with the cloud vendors. We have a particularly strong integration with Amazon, with AWS. What it means is you'll give it your secret key and what's the other one, access code. And then it will display a nice little screen of all the available RDS instances and let you add them cleanly to PMM, okay? We don't quite have that level of integration yet with Azure or with Google, but the point is it makes your experience with Amazon a little bit quicker and more seamless. But it works with all the cloud platforms out there. If you're using, database as a service from DigitalOcean, it'll work. As long as there's a MySQL port, we can connect to it. And just as a caveat, or so you understand, I'm on the MySQL side, so I tend to just think in that one direction. But Postgres and Mongo is important, so not to give them any second shrift, but my first and foremost is about MySQL. Okay, so now what have you got? You've got in your environment, all of us have pretty much talked about how we use PMM already. You've got a PMM server that's doing data point collection, and it's got a web backend to it. There's a Grafana web endpoint. You're on your desktop and you're running your browser, and you might be SSHing into your clients out there. The clients themselves, meaning your database servers, have a local package installed, which is the PMM client. So it's a client-server architecture. Well, what can you do when you've already got the client installed? Well, you're already going to get the operating system metrics. You're going to get the memory consumption, the disk throughput, all of that sort of great stuff and being displayed. Well, once you're in there, there's an additional feature of Node Exporter called the text file. We call it the text file collector, or the text file consumer. And what it lets you do is it lets you write any kind of shell script in any language you really want to have. If you could emit in the format that, that Prometheus expects, that Victoria Metrics expects, we can then consume that. So your job is to write some code. It could be very trivial. I've got some examples of 4-line, bash scripts that write out a certain format to on disk, and PMM automatically knows, Node Exporter, but basically PMM knows, look in that directory. If there's a YAML file there, or if there's output file there, consume it. Really, really, really straightforward and simple. And the point is this enables you. We were hearing about that in the keynotes this morning, right? We're trying to make it so developers can innovate on their own. And this is one of those angles here. You can look to Percona. If you have a support agreement with us and you say, I've got this great idea on this other exporter you should be writing, or this other way of consuming data, we want to hear about that. But we might also push back and say, well, look, that's a lot of investment for us to do, a lot of engineering, et cetera. Tools like this, as an example, and I've got several of these, how you can be productive about pulling in data. Text file collector might get you over the hump for the few releases until Percona actually ships you the feature that you're looking for. Okay, so text file. You have 3 different ways that you can get the data in. All that really means, I'm talking about these resolution levels. Those are what frequency are you trying to collect the data? So you got to think about it. My examples are going to be around like number of users logged in. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. The resolution levels are just on what frequency are you going to collect the data. The more frequently you collect it, the more tighter the resolution and the better that your graphs are going to look. You're going to be able to view the ups and downs. However, if you're going to pick something that just doesn't change that frequently, for example, my example here, the next one coming up is around temperature collection and CO2 and VOCs and things like that. That's not changing that much in a per second level. So it doesn't really make sense to scrape it that frequently. You're going to pay a penalty later for additional disk storage. So the idea is we've given you 3 different levels. By default, now the defaults have just recently changed, but I believe our default for high resolution is every 5 seconds, medium is every 30, and then 60 seconds for low. Question? Why do we have different resolutions instead of being able to do it in a config? Well, you're basically, you're stuck with whatever resolution level you set at a global level. Meaning in the PMM server, you can adjust what these resolution levels are. First thing I do with a customer is I set my high resolution from 5 seconds down to 1 second. Because I love to know what threads running is and that sort of thing. Because it will change often, frequently enough, every second. Well, that has the unintended consequence of pushing the resolution levels also different for Node Exporter. I think it's one of those lacking features in PMM that you can't, on a per server level, set different resolution levels, different scraping resolution levels, right? So the idea being is if you're going to track logged in users or temperature, you probably want to put them into a low resolution bucket because otherwise you're going to just be storing the same number over and paying a penalty storage cost for that. Question? Yeah, the question is can you modify the resolution level and the storage requirement later? Absolutely you can. Resolution level can be modified anytime, and by default, we're storing 30 days of history in the time series database, the Victoria metrics. That's just a flag that you can change in PMM server, set it to 60 days or more. I see what you're saying. So the question is, let's just make up an example. I've got 90 days history. For 30 days, the most recent 30 days, I want 1 second. 31 to 60 days, I want 5 seconds. PMM isn't going to do that for you. You would have to write some sort of a script to interface with the Victoria Metrics API and basically selectively do dropping of data like that. Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be a good feature. Yeah, that would be something more on the Victoria Metrics team to, well, I guess Percona to identify that and say, look, this is what users want. But it makes a great sense, right? If anybody's used some of the Nagios and Isinga and Cacti. Cacti is the one I'm thinking of where you had to use these RRD databases. Anybody familiar with those, RRD format? Yeah, remember how up front you had to be very clear about how big the file is going to be and for 5 days store at this resolution? It was kind of a pain, but that was also a really nice way of minimizing your data usage. So I guess that's kind of what's lacking in these newer generation time series storage systems. Okay, so let's talk just quickly about that Prometheus format. I'm going to use interchangeably Prometheus and Victoria metrics, but think of them basically as the same thing. It's designed to be super simple. The simpler, the better. The easier to troubleshoot. And all it really means is that there's basically 2 lines that get emitted in the format of the Prometheus format. The first one is just a help line, and that's good for us who are picking up a new exporter and we're like, there's a whole bunch of lines here. What do they mean? The help is intended to be a nice human-friendly text string. Leave it at that. The type, this is actually, now unfortunately I had too long of a name. This is actually all 1 line. So 1 line, 1 line, okay? The idea being is you give it a very long, well, a label that's descriptive. In that label, it behooves you, especially if you're developing your own exporter, and I encourage you to because they're super duper simple. It's Bootstrap Go code. You add about 20 more lines and you have an exporter. Like, dead simple. You want to make these metric strings as useful as possible. And by useful, I think you need to describe what your technology is, generally is the first word. You want to give it some sort of definition over, is this an aggregation? Is it an individual count of something, et cetera, et cetera? And then something useful about the actual metric. And then finally, I find it very helpful to define the unit of measure. Is it seconds? Is it milliseconds? Is it what have you? In this case, it's parts per billion, right? It doesn't matter on day 1 because you're writing your code and you got your dashboards designed and everything's in your head. But in month 6, you're going to go, oh, was it seconds? Why do my graphs have the wrong scale? That sort of thing is going to come back to haunt you. So use things like putting the unit of measure in there. And then the last thing, in this example, it's actually showing it as an integer, but the storage of Victoria metrics is actually a float 64. And what does that mean? It means you can have a whole bunch of decimal places after the dot. So you can store very high resolution data as long as it's a number. Victoria metrics can store text strings, but it's not its sweet spot. It is all about it being a float 64 or an integer value that you're storing, okay? That's what the metrics are designed to be. Question? So the question is, do you need to do any declaration of the types beforehand? Sort of yes and sort of no. You will define at runtime what kind of a value is it. And I've mentioned it here, the difference between a counter and a gauge, okay? A counter is an example, uptime is a good example of it. It's only ever going to increment. Threads running or temperature is a good example of a gauge. That's a number that's going to go up and down. It doesn't matter to Victoria metrics in terms of the storage of it. I think it probably does something special with the compression of it and all that mumbo jumbo, but from putting the numbers in, no, it doesn't matter. Where it does matter to you or to us as consumers of the dashboards, the developers of the dashboards, it will change the types of formulas you'll use on it. There are certain types of aggregations that only make sense with a counter or calculating differences between values. And Prometheus, Victoria metrics, exposes a programming language called PromQL, and you need to use the right kind of aggregation for the right data type that you've got. So I'll leave it at that. This isn't intended to be a PromQL talk, but the point is you do want to be fairly clear about what you're storing, more for yourself rather than for the database, okay? And I don't know if this is just a cute thing. I don't know if anybody's used these laser eggs, these Kytera things, but they're just these little pods that you plug in at home and they'll tell you what your air quality is for your neighborhood. I moved to Mexico and I was disappointed or I was scared about how bad the air quality would be, but it's kind of reassured me. I've seen that it's not actually so bad where I live. So I don't know, peace of mind, feeling good about going for a run in a contaminated atmosphere. It made me feel better about where I lived. So if you guys are into that stuff, the criteria is a pretty rad little tool. Okay, so let's get into some examples here. This is as simple as you need to make it. You can do it in a single one-liner. And this is a trivial example, like who really cares? But this is about how do I figure out how many people are logged into this Linux server that I'm on? Run the who command, do some grep against it, or sorry, some count the lines, some sed to make it look pretty. It ends up writing it into a directory right here. And now, I'm not a big fan of this. Look at how long that directory is and how deep it is. But the idea is anything under user local Percona is controlled by us, by PMM. And you just need to write it into a file that ends in .prom. You're done. You don't have to restart the agent. You don't have to do anything else. PMM or node exporter, more appropriately, will read that directory and start writing that data. Whatever it sees in there will write it into Victoria metrics. Okay? So again, super duper easy. In this case, it's cron. I probably wouldn't do it that way in production, but it's good enough to demonstrate where you can go with it. The question is, will PMM keep polling a directory? Yes. It's always looking for the existence of a file. If it finds one that ends in .prom, it'll consume it and store it into the database. Now, if you've made some typos, if you used a string at the end instead of a float 64 value, you got to check your logs, and you're obviously not going to see the data stored, but that's on you, really. And you can do that through system control using journal control if you want to see the logs of the PMM agent. That's where you want to look for any types of errors that are coming out, because it's all systemd integrated. I assume you're using a relatively recent operating system. The Red Hats and the Ubuntus or the Debians are all systemd. Okay, another one. Again, just a super trivial with a few more lines. I want to see how many people have failed logging in. So I'll pull an authentication failure using grep against the secure varlog secure and emit it out into a different file in the same directory. Again, in this case, we're using low resolution because you don't expect that to change on a per second or frequently enough for it to really matter. So don't pay the penalty. And what you can see here is that we're just adding, this is going to be the name of the metric series, right? It could be whatever you want, but it's important to start it with where is the data coming from? Node or MySQL or Postgres. That first string is important because it's going to help you when we look at the sorting of all of these. There's hundreds, if not thousands of metric series already in Victoria metrics that our exporters have put in there. So you want to have them organized in a logical manner. Okay, so that's text file. That's if you just want to write some shell or Python or whatever that can write it a text file. That's the way to do it, is through text file collector. That's number one.
Just to confirm, once you return to that top file, write down, then it will automatically.
Question is, and I'm repeating these because it's only recording our audio for the webinars. The question is, once you've written to that directory, are you done? Absolutely. As long as the file's there, it'll consume it, and as long as there's no typos, and away you go. Okay, now, I think this is probably the hottest, one of the coolest features of PMM. And it's not thanks to Percona, really. Before Percona, Prometheus was out there. And that means that people already had developed the beginnings of a MySQL exporter and Postgres exporter. Well, those guys, Mongo doesn't have it yet, but those first two technologies I mentioned have a way where yet you write another file to another different directory, and then boom, you're going to collect data. You can probably guess, in this case, since it's a database, you're going to write some select rather than a text file, right? Well, I'm sorry. You're going to write a text file, but actually that text file gets interpreted and runs a query against the database. And this is where I really like it. I'll get customers come to me and say, well, look, we're really big. We're doing however many millions of dollars with you. Okay, you're important to us. And they say, well, can you write me, can you add this to the exporter to collect all this stuff that's unique to my environment? And I get it. That makes a lot of sense for you. You want to display some cool stuff like, I don't know, how many users are currently logged in, or out of your users table, how many of them have been deactivated or haven't logged in for 30 days, or these are things you can just pop out because you can write a select on it. But it doesn't make sense for Percona to put that into the tool because it's your environment, not ours, not the person sitting next to you here, right? So we have to be judicious about it. This particular feature means write your own select of your own data set and enrich PMM with that, okay? So nothing totally different. It's got 3 resolution levels. You're going to write it in a YAML format. That's the only thing. And I don't know about you guys, but it breaks my brain sometimes with YAML, missing a couple spaces here and there. That's where you got to be hyper vigilant with the tailing the logs to see if you've got anything broken. But other than that, it's a great feature. Let me show you what you can do with it. So it's a bit longer, right? I'll just break down the pieces here. The very first line is going to be the name or the beginning of the name of your metric series. In this case, we're going to start with MySQL. It's a subsection is in the InnoDB. And in this case, I want to collect some index statistics. I know I can fetch that from the MySQL schema. You could be fetching data. I have some other examples for fetching from information schema, maybe the size of tables or most recent analyze or anything like that. The idea being, you give it a name, you indent a bit, and then you write your actual query. Now, as a pro tip, make sure you put in the schema that it's coming from. I did one of those like live webinars with Matt Yankovic a couple years ago, and we ended the system without realizing we were making errors. We weren't collecting the data because we were omitting the schema name. So don't let that happen to you. Make sure you put in MySQL dot whatever or information schema dot whatever or your schema dot whatever. Okay. So you write your query, and you're going to write that query. You're going to be the only one who knows how to do it. This is obviously generic enough that it would work in anybody's environment, but you might write a select from your users table on some criteria, right? Then you get into the naming of it. Now we need to be careful about what we're pulling out of it. You can see here we're using a variation of gauge. Oh, I didn't put in an example of a counter. But the idea being is this is the only thing that's actually going to get measured. All I'm really caring about this select is the index size in bytes. The other three pieces of data that are going to come out of it are going to get turned into labels. And that means out of this query, I know it's going to be a multi-row result set. It's going to be a row per table. So it's going to attach them as a label. Go ahead. Yes, slides. The question is, will slides be shared? Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to get into what labels are by showing some actual examples. But labels are basically attached to the metric series, and they help you refine it. Maybe you only want to write a dashboard, and you've got 5 schemas, and you want to have it show only one schema at a time. We'll look at some drop downs on how to do that, so you can show both for yourself and for your team how to focus their attention by using, categorization or basically the group bys of looking at the data set differently. And that's where labels come in. Okay, so I know this one's kind of in a weird way of looking at it. I'm going to show on the live demo, there's a dashboard called Advanced Data Exploration that Peter built. And that's what this is based on. And I love it because it just lets you really quickly look for that metric series you just wrote or developed and see if it's changing. It's actually got a couple different sections. I'm only showing one piece of it, but you can tell very quickly if it's a gauge or a counter just by looking at the data set over, in this case, the last hour or something like that, okay? So the point is you start building this, you write these text files, and then you can immediately go to PMM and start exploring that. You don't yet put that on a dashboard because you don't know how it's going to look, but at least you got to start looking at the metric series over however long you've been collecting, the last 5 minutes or something.
So this is some sort of browser exploration page or whatever that shows you what unwrapped, currently unwrapped metrics.
The question is, what are we going to get out of advanced data exploration? Well, I'll actually demo it, but the idea is that you can just take one metric series and understand something about it. We've intentionally on that dashboard treated it like it's a gauge and a counter and shown you different, and then there's a table format at the bottom, like a whole bunch of ways of just looking at your data and going, oh, I didn't realize that. It's really important. Or, you know what? I spent a lot of time developing this and it doesn't tell me anything useful. I don't need it, right? But you get a taste of it before you go and you spend a whole bunch of time building a new dashboard. Or at least focusing your attention on, oh, I need to relate these 3 data points that I've just built onto one graph. So anyway, it's good for focusing your attention. That's how I look at it. I'm just going to go quickly through this. 1, because I'm not a Postgres guy, and 2, it's very repetitive of the MySQL side. I do want to highlight, though, that it gives you the same equivalent, resolution levels we've talked about a bunch of times. You write a YAML file. It's the same format in the sense of like you put the name of it at the top. Now, I guess I did choose quite a poor title for it. I should have done more than just PG class. But the idea being is you need to come up with a query, and then you label it. You're giving labels, and then in this case, there's a few gauges that get emitted from it, okay? So the idea being, Postgres works the same as MySQL. Question?
So the schemas, you define them as tables in MySQL or Postgres, or where are these schemas?
I'm not clear on the question.
So, like for example, the schema, right? Or query.
The schema for the query. Like, well, so if I understand correctly, what in this particular, you're asking about what does this actual query do? This one here? Well, this one I think is trying to get back some. Okay, what are the gauges? Total disk space, indexes. Okay, so this is kind of an information schema from MySQL, but the Postgres way of doing it. It's going to output 3 different values, and they're all going to be independent metric series. And I guess it's because it's not already exposed by some system level table in Postgres. Again, I'm super naive on Postgres, so apologize if I'm butchering it, right? But the idea is get your query working fine from the command line and then pop it into a file like this. Okay, and so our Postgres deployment is still pretty thin. There's only a couple dashboards in there. We should, over the next few releases, be improving that. But basically, it allows us to, again, explore our data. In this case, it's got a lot more lines because we've been able to pull back. In the example, there were 3 different values coming out of it. So a lot more metric series are being displayed. Okay, so we've talked about 3 different ways so far. You can use text file exporter if you can write a text file collector if you can write a script, and then you've got MySQL and Postgres if you can write a custom query. You're writing a select. Makes no sense to write anything other than a select. What if you don't want to go write any queries on it, and you know that there's already an exporter out there? Let's say you're using proxy SQL. Let's say you're using Redis or Memcache. Don't go rewrite it. Somebody's already written it years ago, and it's been, QA'd and battle tested. Go and use it. In our case, in this example, I've got something called Process Exporter. And it's really simple. It's been out there a while. It has very little commits lately because it just works. And the idea of this one is it will keep track of how many instances of a given binary are running on your Linux box. Nothing complex about it. What I like to see is how many SSHD sessions are on there, how many bash sessions. Particularly with databases, what else is running on there that isn't MySQL? If I see a bunch of Perl running all the time or PHP, that's a good question for my customer to be like, are you sure you should be running your web server on your database? Where do we need to go with this? So this is really helpful because what I find, data is much more convincing than any type of personality I think you can have. Whether you're introvert or extrovert, data on a screen, particularly a graph, tells a story that it crosses languages. And again, I think at this moment of evolution of databases, we've been working with monitoring and graphs for a very long time. So I don't feel like I'm introducing anything new. But I do want to remind us all that a graph can very quickly communicate some information, particularly to your managers or to some other team over, look, it's not me, it's not Michael, it's not my opinion. It's based on research and some subjective values. So I'm a huge believer in using data to prove my points. Okay, so back to the process exporter. The responsibility with PMM is on you to deploy and keep that exporter running. We don't yet have any functionality in there to go deploy process exporter on some remote system. It'd be great. Maybe we'll get there in PMM version 3. But in PMM 2, it doesn't exist. Your responsibility is to download a build for your platform. Right? If you're running on AMD 64, no problem. You're going to find that everywhere. So download it off of GitHub, start up the daemon, write a systemd for it, and you'll find lots of systemd startup scripts on our website and in our documentation. So that part shouldn't be too difficult. You get the binary running, and in the case of Memcache, as a simple example, there's no login, there's no authentication. So just by telling it where is my Memcache backend and what port it's on, boom, that binary should start collecting data. This example of Process Explorer is even simpler. There's nothing to authenticate against. It's just running in user space on a Linux host. So it's already natively just doing its own internal PS and then displaying it in the Prometheus format we talked about earlier. Okay? So now, where does it get interesting? You want to integrate it with PMM. You need to use the PMM admin, which is your entry point to any type of command line activity with PMM. PMM admin, then you give it a verb. In this case, we're doing add. We want to add a new service. We have an external type, I guess. The other ones would be, just for example, would be add MySQL, add Postgres, add Mongo, add proxy SQL, okay? So you add all this stuff. You need to tell it, though, because each exporter that's out there in the ecosystem has their own port. And I don't know who, it's certainly not RFC-based ports. It's just kind of randomly picked by the developer when they built it, which is fine. But you need to pay attention to that. You need to note that, and then you need to tell PMM about it. And then some of these extra labels are just additional. I think they're going to help you as you develop your dashboards. So I'm talking about environment, replication set, and cluster. Those are designed so later you can maybe have some better drop downs. Look, if your environment is all of 3 servers and you call them Zeus and Athelia and things, simple things like that, you're dealing with like, you know, the pets versus cattle discussion. But if you've got servers that are called DB107 and so on and so forth, you don't treat them as, you know, little friends anymore. You need to categorize them. And that's where these extra labels come in. So I encourage you to use them. They're not required, they're optional, but go ahead and take advantage of them. The group, I haven't actually found a great reason to use it, but I do add it anyway. It's just another label that you can add. I haven't tried to add that to any of my dashboards, but group is certainly optional. And then service name for me is critical because I want my drop downs to look nice and clean and complete. The default naming scheme in PMM, for better or worse, when you look at the node, is the host name. Makes sense, right? DB107. Well, if you're adding the MySQL service to it and you're doing it without setting the service name, it'll say DB107-MySQL. Super easy, or dash Postgres or dash whatever. In this case, so I'm making sure I add this additional dash processes, okay? In most cases, many cases, Grafana is a VC-based company, right? They were called, I think they're called Grafana Labs now. So they're making money. They've got a good ecosystem around them. So I've already spoken a lot about the ecosystem of Prometheus and getting the exporters out there. Grafana already has also a very large deployment of dashboards that people have created in the past. Again, these are just JSON things. People, you can create a dashboard in 5 minutes or less. Question? The question is, what's the advantage of, I guess, going through this work using PMM that you're not going to get with just a default Grafana deployment? Yeah. Are you, can I suggest that you're angling to how do I integrate PMM with my existing monitoring? So if I already, so just to paraphrase, if I already have a monitoring instance and it happens to be Grafana and maybe even Prometheus, why would I go to the effort of putting in PMM? Fair enough. PMM is not designed to go into your enterprises of, you know, where you're 1,000 employees or more and displace your existing monitoring. No way. It's not there yet. And maybe it never will be. But I think it's complementary. I think first and foremost, you'll find that the exporters and the dashboards are much, much richer around databases. But what does that mean? Well, you could go back to your own environment and run our exporter. And all that really means is we've cleaned up the labels and then pull in our dashboards into your Grafana and start using PMM, at least from the metric side. And then not even deploy PMM itself. You're just going to pull in our dashboards from GitHub and the exporters from GitHub as well, and away you go. So that's one way of doing it, where you just basically own and pull those in as you see dashboards get updated on GitHub. That's one way to do it. Sorry, let me just finish this and I'll come right to you. And then the other way that I've seen some people do it is there's some proxying features within Grafana and also actually I think within the time series databases to say, oh, the data's not here, go to this like other system. And it does that transparently. So that lets you then deploy PMM out there, but nobody ever loads the Grafana interface directly. They go through your prod one and get routed over there. So that way you get those rich database graphs and everything, and you just click the upgrade button in PMM server, and you don't have to do any dashboard imports or any of that sort of thing. So those are the two ways that I see it existing today. Okay, question? Yeah, just if I could add to that too. There's a lot of deflection point. As an org is 5 people, you just want to go find something that works because you're probably not monitoring at all yet. Whereas you get to some threshold level and there's a tremendous amount of involvement of monitoring, and it's not even just about databases. Your app servers this and servers that are all getting consumed, and maybe you're even writing it yourself as your org gets large enough. So of course there's this momentum in wanting to keep it to one URL that isn't the PMM one. But as an aside to that, some of my customers, what they'll do is they will deploy just PMM so they can get query analytics out of it. And they'll share that link with a few DBAs that that have a concern about it. So it doesn't in any way replace anything, it enhances, and yes, it is a separate URL, but the tool is there and it's free to use. So I think we had a question over here.
Michael, I think I was having a similar question yesterday, right? Remember?
Yes, the question yesterday around how do I integrate this with my other existing monitoring platform? Totally. And if I was still the PM, I'd be saying, I'll get back to you on that. What I'm going to say today is I'm going to take that to the PM and be like, look, 2 days in a row, people are talking about how do I integrate this with my existing monitoring. I want a clean story. I want you to just click a button kind of thing and it just works. You know, I don't want dashboards getting imported. I think that's too much work. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I just want to call this out so everybody's on the same page. I mentioned earlier there's multiple databases inside PMM Server. Let's be clear about what those are. 95% of your disk space is going to be taken up by the time series stuff, by the Victoria metrics. Looking at those pretty graphs, lines up and down, per second, per 5 second, whatever. Cool. The other database in there, just to get out of the way, it's a Postgres database, and it stores the state of the inventory. It's got just a few rows in each table. Some of our users over here have explored that quite deeply and re-implemented some of it. So, but that database is important, but relatively inconsequential. The last one is a ClickHouse database, and that stores the query analytics data. Query analytics are which queries are running in my database, and we have that working for all three technologies. Well, it depends if you use performance schema versus slow log in MySQL, you get a different view because performance schema gives you like 5 columns of data, whereas slow log could give you 14 to 21 or something like that. Anyway, you have all this data stored, which is strings in a ClickHouse database, okay? What that led us to is the query analytics application or the view is an actual app that needs to get built. It's not just a dashboard that you can do through JSON and just copy it and pull it in and import it. So for me, the reason I'm building up to this is that it's not as easy to proxy or to display query analytics in your Grafana labs as it would be to do just the dashboard stuff, just the metric series. And I think that's on Percona to really own that and find a good story to tell and make query analytics consumable outside of just the PMM installation. I totally hear you. It resonates with me. My last year, I've been working my afternoons with Pinterest, and they're the same, where they've rolled their own monitoring internally. Totally makes sense. I ask them out of the gates, why aren't you using PMM? And they just give me this look like, are you joking? We're not going to rip out that and put in PMM. Like, oh, okay, I was naive. I shouldn't have said that, you know. But in their particular case, we will deploy PMM for query analytics on a per backend type when we need to do some inspection on it. Now, they're very well automated, Terraform this and Ansible that. But the point is within 5 minutes, they can have PMM up and running and then blow it away and really only use the query analytics part of it to talk to their database and, between database people and their developers, right? So it's a temporary application for them. That's how they use PMM, query analytics. So the question is, if you're just using PMM temporarily in the model that Pinterest is, well, they've already got their slow logs always enabled. So the data is there to be consumed. And then I'm just trying to think through their code deployment. I think I also need to push the PMM client to go out to each of the databases. So I deploy the PMM server and I also push out the agent. And then it sees the slow log is there and then it starts sending it to the right PMM endpoint in the back end. But the point is with these guys is they want to minimize their costs. Everybody's feeling the pinch over reduced advertising and stuff like that, them as well. And so they don't want these large instances running for too long. Troubleshoot the problem and throw it away. Makes me kind of hurt inside because I wish it'd stay up longer and they'd have better history on their queries and stuff like that. But they're like, it's fine. Great, I get your point, Michael, but I don't want to do that. Okay? Okay, so with this example here, if there's still time at the end, I do want to see if I can get this working. It should take just a couple seconds, well, maybe a minute or two. But the idea is you do this add external, and then you load in a dashboard, and away you go. Okay, how do you deploy a dashboard, though? Well, there's a couple ways. One is you can write it yourself. It's fun. You know, a weekend when the kids are still sleeping and you've already done your run or you're having a coffee, that's a great time to sit down and try to develop a dashboard. But you're probably going to bump your head against stuff and be like, this is harder than it should be. Not because it's difficult to click and drag and stuff, but finding the right metric series and putting them on the right graphs is an operation on your brain. And I find anyway that I'm never really done with my dashboards. You guys, everybody's into observability at some level. So, whatever tool you're using, you've probably been down this road. I've tried to build dashboards and they've just taken me longer than I thought. In this particular example, what I want to highlight is how you can not write it yourself, but you can pull in somebody else's work. In this case, I'm highlighting Peter's. He wrote this dashboard that actually doesn't hit the Victoria metrics. It hits the ClickHouse data. And so I wanted to highlight that we can just pull in a dashboard really easily that gets you some rich data that isn't out there yet, in the sense that nobody else has developed this dashboard and nobody else has really tried to profile the data that's in ClickHouse other than query analytics. So let's see if we can, what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to save the demo for the end. I'll come back to actually doing it. But the idea being is you go find your dashboard. In this particular case, there's no other explorer to set up. The data is already being collected in a test environment or in your prod environment. You just import the dashboard and away you go, okay? So I'm going to show some of the examples. I think I have screenshots here of what they're going to look like. I'll be able to pull these things up as live as well. The idea being is each of these graphs are a distinct section or graph that was built on a new dashboard. And the back end is not the time series, it's the ClickHouse data set. So what do we learn about that? What are some things that MySQL doesn't tell you? You don't necessarily know the quantity of errors, but your slow log will know some of that, right? Or your performance schema might know some of it. Your database isn't going to know per query latency unless you're using user stat from Percona server. That gives you kind of a measure on it, but that's a different kind of latency. It's an aggregated bucket based on histograms. So there's a way to visualize it. It's already in PMM, the histogram stuff. But what if you're actually more concerned about some other level of aggregation on query latency? We can offer you that here by using this particular dashboard, okay? And so at the top level, it's showing for all the instances, and at the bottom, it'll give you, obviously it's cut off, but there's a row per database in your environment. You can check things now. You can get queries per host, sure, from within PMM, because you know that there's a COM questions that's being incremented. But we don't always know things like what the efficiency is. And this is where you can get creative about it. If you're, not that you're gonna write a PhD thesis on this, but you might be like, look, I got this simple little formula that I wanna try out. Like I think when, load gets above 50, I think things get slow. Something like that. Well, then you can build your own little new, not even dashboard, but graph, and plot a line when threads running hits 50. That's just some big fat red bar. And then plot your queries per second. And maybe you show as it gets up to threads running high, then the performance goes down, queries come down, or something to that effect. The reason I use that trivial example is that's also what Peter's got here. He's got this idea based on the efficiency of the reads, and then down below there's a write section. Right or wrong, I don't know. I haven't really tried to explore his formulas, whether they're accurate or not. Again, this is just food for thought for you to be like, look, I can do some math, I can do some arithmetic, I put it into PromQL, and I let the dashboard do all the heavy lifting for me. At the very bottom of it, what I like about this, so let's just pay attention to the fact we've got graphs here and we're plotting it with colors and ups and downs and stuff like that. You can also use table format to describe some interesting data. Now this essentially is a repeat of query analytics, but with a different kind of skinning to it. So in this case, you can't get error. Well, maybe I'm dating myself. Maybe now you can get errors in PMM query analytics, but for a while you couldn't. And so this would tell you which query is emitting the most amount of errors. That's probably useful, right? You probably want to report that to your dev team or go, oh, I don't care. I can ignore that right now. But anyway, highlight it, identify it, right? Queries causing the load is the same idea of what query analytics out of the gates is already designed to do. So that's repetitive right there. And I don't see what the title is of the first block at the top. I won't stress that one. Okay, but the point is, this is an example of a customized dashboard. And again, I hope I have time. I'll deploy it and we'll see if we can make it look pretty. Okay? The other angle, and this is where there's some caveats. You can build your own dashboard, you can import a dashboard, and you can modify a dashboard. Well, modifying a dashboard could apply to ones you've pulled in, and you're probably going to end up wanting to do that to pick the colors and make it look a little bit better. But you also might feel that you want to modify an existing system dashboard from Percona. Go ahead. Is there version control in the dashboards? Absolutely there is. In this case, you can go ahead and modify what I think of as the vanilla or the system dashboards. Like, I don't know, MySQL instances overview. Cool. You want to fix a bug? That belongs as a PR to us. Fix it on your instance, submit a PR, we'll fix it in later releases. What's going to happen to you, though, on that dashboard? You can edit it. It's going to throw you a really big warning saying you probably shouldn't do that. At the upgrade step, it's going to wipe away your edits and push in the fresh dashboard. We're not going to try to do any merging. We're just going to ignore what you have, and we're going to put in the latest version, even if that version hasn't changed. So if you're getting in the mode of modifying dashboards, you're better to create a copy of it and then edit the copy. It's kind of a pain that way because then you got to talk to your teams and be like, don't use that vanilla one, use this one over here. So then maybe you want to delete the other one. That's kind of on you to manage that system. But basically, don't edit the default ones or you're going to be in trouble, okay? Oh, that's the first point I made up there. The dashboards by default are not set to edit, and that's a good thing. It's kind of a pain for you because you're going to be editing, but for the other 90%, 99% of people using your platform, you don't want them messing with it. You want to set that thing to lock. So that's why you have to actively go and set an edit mode on it, okay? So the question is around, would it be nice to have that where you could load in maybe your own dashboards, etc. If you go to our GitHub project, everything github.com/Percona, right? All of our stuff is matured from Percona Labs into the Percona namespace, whatever that is. and it's called Grafana-dashboards, okay? You can go and pull those up. Dashboards are just JSON, really long ones, but they're just JSON files. There's 2 Python scripts. There's an import and an export. So you could go, what I would do is I'd create a fork of Grafana dashboards. I'd dump and then check in, commit your own modifications, your own new dashboards into that directory. And then you can run that Python script. Yeah, I think you pass it like some API endpoint, something, but it's really straightforward to use. And set that up on your CI/CD after you do an upgrade to it, have it read that directory, and push in any new dashboards. That's probably what I would do. Yeah, or at least even explore that code and be like, oh, I see what they're doing here. Yeah. Yeah, I get your point. I think our documentation should be clear about, oh, hey, there's these 2 little scripts in here with some examples on it. I think if we had that in our docs. One thing I do want to highlight that Percona's made a big change on, yes, we have documentation writers and all that stuff, but they're engaged in like new feature stuff. We've put all of our documentation available to be edited on GitHub. So not that you have to, but it's optional. You can click the edit and submit a PR to improving our docs if you see something that needs fixing, whether it's typo to adding 5 new lines or something in between. Just so that you're aware of that. Okay, the alerting section, we struggled with this a little bit yesterday, trying to make things work. And what really ended up happening there is that we've been through, if you've been following PMM, I think now 3 different types of alerting, probably way too many, and that's over the period of about a year, maybe a year and a half. We've finally settled, and this has only been the last few releases, on using the Grafana alerting platform. Meaning, we were just building it ourselves as separate apps, and now we said, away with all that code. Grafana in release 8, I think it was, came up with a pretty tight alerting platform. And what does that mean? Well, we're calling it technical preview, and that's just cagey words for us to say it's beta, or if it breaks, don't blame us. And I said this yesterday, and I feel kind of like, I said yesterday that this is not really production ready. It will alert on your environment, but with Percona still putting this tag of it being in technical preview, if it breaks, it's not going to damage your databases, but what's more dangerous, I think, is that it doesn't tell you when there's a problem and you're depending on it. I wouldn't yet count on it to be 100% catching your problems. It hasn't been through enough bugs, I don't think, yet. It's a fairly new release still for Grafana. I'm like, don't put it in prod, and if you do, cross your fingers. That's all I'm trying to say. You can build it, you can deploy it, and it looks good. I just don't know if there's going to be any rough edges yet, because it's only been 3 or 4 months we've had it out there. No, it's not based on Alert Manager. Well, actually, I don't know. It's written all internally within the Grafana engine itself, so React or something else like that. Alert Manager is its own separate binary that runs, and I haven't seen that on our PMM instances, so I don't think it's Alert Manager based. So, okay. So I just want to mention it. This isn't a class really about doing the alerting. We're going to get some demos on the dashboards in just a moment. And then the last one I've talked about before is the advisors. And again, this isn't also about dashboard designs or anything like that. But what it is it's a nice feature for even a guy like me. I've been doing audits and helping customers for over a decade now on MySQL. Our advisors at the highest level, they're tiered. If you're just using a free, not telling us who you are, you're going to get a dozen or so advisors. If you go to the other extreme where you're a Percona customer and you've linked it to our portal, you're going to get, I think it's around 90 or so advisors for MySQL. Some of them will be totally useless. Like one of them is like alerting you if TLS is not enabled. Like, well, so what? You know, maybe my environment doesn't need that yet, so maybe that shouldn't be an advisor. Another one, though, is around InterDB flush logs at transaction commit. It's going to show you a big red if you're on a non, what's the rate? Like a non-safe setting, okay? The idea being is that there's all these things of like maybe misconfigurations you've made. Your buffer pool isn't big enough based on the ratio of RAM. Here's a hint, and that's where the advisors come in. They're to just red flag something or yellow flag or green flag something you're doing and call your attention to it, okay? And I think also there's going to still be a lot of innovation or a lot of engineering attached to the advisors. We want to make it, I wouldn't go so far as to say like the AI model or any of that sort of stuff, but the idea being is that there's a lot of learning that we can do in PMM about your database environment and possibly suggest some tuning that is beyond just a threshold. Something around, I don't know, InterDB, IO values or something to that effect. Based on analysis of the data that's in Victoria metrics, could then educate a recommendation in an advisor is the point I want to build to here. That we could have stronger code, give you better recommendations. Okay, so just watch for that to improve. Okay, so while it says thank you, I want to switch to the demo now. and see if I can make things work. Sorry? Oh, am I at it? Oh, it's 11. I thought it was 11:50 we finished that. I keep looking at my watch. Is it 11:30 we end at? Oh, okay. Okay, let's do it. Let's see what we can do. Gotta switch. Test. Okay, good. Let's see what we can do. Okay, first, I wanted to pull in the dashboard. So from the, I think I need to be able to click it. Okay, so let's do a quick one because I know it should go well. Okay, go to the dashboard. Right, so it's grafana.com/dashboards. There are so many of them there. You want to make sure, though, in our case, now I'm not at the search screen, but one of the search filters is the data source. In our case, we want to select Prometheus because Grafana also works with Influx and a whole bunch of other back-end systems, and they're all different. So in our case here, we're already linked directly to what to the web page for the dashboard itself. You can quickly use a copy ID. Oh, and let me pull over my... Oops, wrong one. Yeah, here it is. Okay, make it full screen. There we go. Okay, so on the left-hand side, all of our menu system, there is one for dashboards. There it is. And down here under import, oops, there's a box. Oh, that's the wrong domain. Hold on. I just deployed a new one for this talk, so. All right, so you choose import. I've already copied that ID. Just paste it in. It'll go out and fetch information about it. And this is where you need to make some edits. You need to tell it what your ClickHouse data source is and your Prometheus data source. Because in fact, this dashboard's gonna access two different locations. Import it, and then just stand back. In this particular case, the data's already being collected. There were no new exporters to deploy or anything like that, okay? So your dashboard's immediately useful. And you can do this. There's a lot of other PMM dashboards that we haven't pushed into the project yet because they're unrefined. I've written some on MySQL Semi-Sync and some other replication dashboards that I've only ever pushed to Grafana because I haven't been able to get the engineers to actually integrate it yet. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is there are a whole bunch of dashboards that say designed for PMM2. So you can go to grafana.com and search for those and pull them in, and you'll already find that the data sets probably are already there, the metric series, and it's just gonna be a different way to visualize it, okay? So that's one way of doing it. Let me find my text screen. Oh, it's on the right-hand side. Okay, so you want to get onto your database server. And what were we going to do here? Oh, we were going to do the process exporter. So let me find the link for that process exporter. This one? Ay, ay, ay. There we go. Hold on. Too many windows open. Okay. So in the slide deck, I have a link already to the process exporter. And feel free to walk. I know some people already have next sessions and things like that. I'm going to keep going until I get this going, but feel free to step or stick around. All right, show me. Oops, wrong way. Okay, there it is. So again, it's the same idea of copying it. Oops. Come on. There it is. Okay, put in the ID, load it. Tell it where the Prometheus data source is, and import it. Now in this case, I haven't actually deployed the process exporter yet. That might take me still a few minutes. So I guess at this point I'm gonna pause because there's already another talk that has to come in. The idea being, again, find that ID or the URL for that dashboard, you import it, and then you run the PMM admin command to add that data source, that external data source, and you'll have the data getting loaded in and appearing on your dashboard. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you everybody for coming to my talk. It was a pleasure having you here.